Young boy tells the court, "You're my mom," freezing the entire courtroom. Everything seemed routine in the courtroom that day. Lawyers presenting their arguments, a judge presiding with her usual authority. But then a 12-year-old boy, Corey, stood up, his voice steady yet filled with emotion, and said something that left everyone frozen. "You're my mom." The entire room fell silent. The judge, a woman known for her composure, looked utterly shaken. What followed was a series of revelations that no one could have predicted, a story of choices, consequences, and the unbreakable bond of family. Stay with us as we uncover the twists, the heartache, and the redemption in this extraordinary tale. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The courtroom felt heavy, its stale air thick with an unspoken tension that weighed on everyone inside. Sunlight filtered through the narrow windows of the Cook County Juvenile Court in Chicago, Illinois, illuminating the polished mahogany benches and casting faint shadows on the faces of those seated. In the center of the room sat a boy, barely 12 years old, dwarfed by the towering adults around him. His name was Corey Bison. Corey's gaze was steady, though his hands clutched his knees tightly, his knuckles white with pressure. Despite his small frame and innocent face, there was a quiet strength in his posture, an unyielding determination that seemed out of place for someone his age. He wore a plain blue sweater that had seen better days, its sleeves slightly too short for his growing arms. But it wasn't the clothes that caught attention. It was his eyes, dark, searching, and filled with something far beyond his years. Across the room, Judge Susan Wilson adjusted her glasses and scanned the case file before her. Her sharp features and carefully styled silver hair gave her an air of authority that commanded respect. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, someone who rarely let emotions cloud her judgment. Today, she wore her signature expression, a mixture of sternness and detachment. "Let us proceed," she said, her voice crisp and unwavering. The Parkers, Corey's foster parents, sat confidently at their table. Helen Parker, a stout woman in her early 50s, leaned into her husband, Mark, as their attorney presented their case. "Your Honor, my clients have provided a stable home for Corey for over 3 years. They've ensured his education, his health care, and his emotional well-being. They believe it is in Corey's best interest to make their custody permanent." The Parkers nodded in unison, their expressions carefully curated for the courtroom. But Corey's lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Jones, wasn't fooled. He had seen the cracks in their story, the empty fridge during home visits, the excuses about locked rooms. Still, it wasn't his turn to speak, and he glanced at Corey, offering a small, reassuring nod. Corey didn't respond. His attention was fixed on the judge. Susan could feel the boy's eyes on her. It wasn't unusual for children to look at her, sometimes with fear, sometimes with hope, but Corey's stare was different. It wasn't pleading or frightened. It was piercing, almost as if he were studying her, searching for something beneath her carefully composed exterior. Her brow furrowed slightly as she returned to the file. His school records were impeccable, straight A's, glowing remarks from teachers about his intelligence and kindness. But his file also told a tragic story, abandoned as an infant, bouncing between foster homes, and now caught in the middle of this custody battle. Susan closed the file and looked up. "Mr. Jones, does Corey wish to address the court?" "Yes, Your Honor, Mr. Jones replied, rising to his feet. "Corey has something important to say." The Parkers' attorney immediately objected. "Your Honor, I don't believe it's appropriate for a child to testify in this setting. This could be traumatic for him." Susan raised a hand, silencing the room. "I allow it," she said firmly. "Corey, you may speak." Corey stood slowly, his small frame seeming even smaller against the imposing backdrop of the courtroom. But as he took a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders and met the judge's gaze. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady but soft, "I know everyone here is talking about what's best for me, but I think I know something that no one else does." Susan tilted her head slightly, curious despite herself. "And what is that, Corey?" The room fell silent, the kind of silence that hums with anticipation. Corey reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a worn photograph, its edges frayed from years of being handled. "This," he said, holding it up for everyone to see, "is a picture of my mom holding me when I was a baby." The judge's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, her professional mask faltered, and a flicker of emotion passed across her face. She quickly recovered, leaning forward to get a better look. Corey walked toward her, his steps slow but deliberate, and placed the photograph on her desk. Susan picked it up, her hands trembling ever so slightly. The image was faded but unmistakable, a younger version of herself, barely in her 20s, holding a newborn in her arms. The words scrawled at the bottom sent a chill through her. "To my baby boy, KB, love, Mom." Susan's world tilted. The courtroom, the people, the sound of her own breathing, all seemed to blur into the background. Her hand tightened around the photo as she looked back at Corey, who was now staring at her with an intensity that felt almost unbearable. "Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence. "You're my mom." The courtroom froze. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and whispers erupted like a wave. Susan's composure shattered, and she sat back in her chair, stunned. The gavel slipped from her hand, clattering against the desk. "Order," she managed to choke out, though her voice was faint. "Order in the court." But there was no order. The truth had detonated like a bomb, and no one, not the Parkers, not the lawyers, and certainly not Judge Susan Wilson, would ever be the same. The whispers in the courtroom refused to fade, swirling like an invisible storm. Judge Susan Wilson sat frozen at the bench, the photograph still trembling in her grasp. She had always prided herself on her ability to control the courtroom, her life, her emotions, but at this moment, all control had slipped through her fingers. Corey stood just a few feet from her, his dark eyes locked onto hers. There was no anger in them, no accusation, just a quiet plea, one that made her chest tighten painfully. "Corey," Susan finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "take your seat, please." The boy hesitated, his small hands fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. Then, with a slight nod, he returned to his chair beside Mr. Jones, who placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Susan cleared her throat and straightened her posture, trying to summon the authority she had always worn like armor. "We will take a recess," she announced, her voice steadier now. "The court will reconvene in 30 minutes. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, but it didn't carry the weight it usually did. It was the sound of a judge trying to escape. Susan sat at her desk, the photograph still clutched tightly in her hand. The silence of her chambers was deafening, amplifying the chaotic thoughts in her mind. She stared at the image, her younger self smiling down at the tiny baby in her arms. Her hair had been longer then, cascading in loose curls. Her face had been softer, untouched by the years of hard decisions and sacrifices. And the baby, Corey, was wrapped in a light blue blanket, his little hand reaching toward her face. Memories she had buried so deeply began to surface, clawing their way into her consciousness. The summer of her second year in law school, the late night studying, the unexpected pregnancy, and the crushing realization that she wasn't ready to be a mother. She had made the decision quickly, convinced it was the right thing to do. The adoption agency had assured her that her baby would go to a loving family, one that could provide everything she couldn't at the time. She had believed them. She needed to believe them. But now, here he was, her son, sitting in her courtroom, calling her mom. Susan pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to steady her thoughts. How had this happened? Why hadn't she been told? Had something gone wrong with the adoption? A knock at the door shattered her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice more brittle than she intended. Her clerk, a young woman named Lisa, stepped inside cautiously. "Judge Wilson, are you all right?" "The courtroom is. Well, everyone's talking." Susan let out a shaky breath. "I'm fine," she lied. "I just need a moment to collect myself." Lisa nodded, though the concern in her eyes didn't fade. "Of course. Let me know if you need anything." As the door closed, Susan leaned back in her chair and stared at the photograph again. She felt the sting of tears but refused to let them fall. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The Parkers sat stiffly at their table, their earlier confidence now replaced with unease. Helen leaned toward her husband, whispering furiously, "What does this mean for us?" she hissed. "If that boy is really hers." Mark cut her off with a sharp gesture. "We don't know anything yet. Let the lawyers handle it." Meanwhile, Corey sat quietly beside Mr. Jones, his hands folded neatly in his lap. The lawyer leaned down and whispered, "You okay, kid?" Corey nodded but didn't speak. His gaze drifted toward the door Judge Wilson had disappeared through, his expression unreadable. 30 minutes later, the courtroom was called back into session. Susan re-entered, her face composed, but her eyes betraying the turmoil beneath. "Before we proceed," she began, her voice firm, "I need to address the statement made earlier by Corey Bison." The room fell silent again, the tension palpable. Corey's claim is a serious one, and it raises questions that this court cannot ignore. "I'm ordering a DNA test to confirm his statement." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the room. "Until we have the results, I will recuse myself from this case to ensure impartiality. Another judge will be assigned to continue these proceedings." Gasps rippled through the courtroom, followed by murmurs of speculation. The Parkers' attorney shot to his feet. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is highly irregular." Susan cut him off with a sharp glare. "Irregular or not, this is the only way forward. If Corey's claim is true, it changes everything. And if it's not, we owe it to him to confirm that as well." The attorney sank back into his seat, clearly frustrated but unwilling to push further. Susan turned to Corey, her voice softening. "Corey, I promise you, we will find the truth. Whatever happens, you deserve that much." The boy nodded, his expression calm, but his eyes glistening with unshed tears. As the courtroom emptied, Susan lingered behind, staring at the empty benches. In the quiet stillness of the space, she felt like a stranger in her own courtroom, the weight of the day's events pressing heavily on her chest. For the first time in years, Susan didn't feel like a judge. She felt like a woman who had made a choice that had come back to confront her in the most unexpected and impossible way. She didn't know what the DNA test would reveal, but deep down, she already knew the truth. The photograph had told her everything she needed to know. Her son had found her. Susan sat at her kitchen table that night, a single desk lamp illuminating the room. The photograph lay before her, its edges frayed from years of handling. Beside it, a cup of tea had grown cold, forgotten in the haze of her thoughts. The quiet hum of her suburban Chicago home felt deafening. This house, with its neatly organized bookshelves and spotless counters, had always been her sanctuary, a place where she could unwind after long days in court. But tonight, it felt foreign, as if the walls themselves were judging her. She picked up the photograph again, her thumb brushing against the faded ink at the bottom. "To my baby boy, KB, love, Mom." The memories she had fought to bury began to surface. It was the summer of 1999. She had just finished her second year of law school, fueled by ambition and the belief that she could conquer the world. She had always been careful, methodical in her decisions, but one night changed everything. A chance encounter, a fleeting romance, and then the realization, weeks later, that she was pregnant. Susan had never told anyone about the pregnancy. Her parents, staunchly traditional and conservative, would have been mortified. Her classmates would have whispered about her behind her back. And her professors, some supportive, others quietly skeptical, might have questioned her commitment to her career. She remembered sitting alone in a clinic, staring at the ultrasound screen as the technician pointed out the tiny flicker of life. It was surreal and terrifying. By the time she gave birth, she had already decided on adoption. She had convinced herself it was the best choice for her and for the baby. The agency had been kind, assuring her that her son would go to a loving family. She had asked for one thing, that he be given a chance at a better life. But now, decades later, Corey's presence in her courtroom suggested otherwise. Susan leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The thought of Corey growing up in foster care gnawed at her. How could she have been so naive? She had imagined a picture-perfect family taking him in, providing him with everything she couldn't at the time. "Did I fail you?" she whispered to the empty room. Her mind replayed the moment he stood in her courtroom, holding up the photograph, the way he had looked at her, not with anger, but with hope. It had been almost unbearable. He wasn't asking for explanations or apologies. He simply wanted her to acknowledge him. The silence was broken by the shrill ring of her phone. Susan flinched, startled, and reached for it. "Hello, Judge Wilson. It's Lisa," her clerk said. "I'm sorry to call so late, but I thought you'd want to know. The DNA testing has been expedited. We should have the results within a few days." Susan's stomach tightened. She knew the results were a formality. The photograph, the timing, the boy's face, everything pointed to the truth. "Thank you, Lisa," she said softly. "Please keep me updated." She hung up and stared at the phone for a long moment. Meanwhile, across the city, Corey sat on the edge of his bed in the Parkers' home. The room was sparse, with plain walls and a twin bed that creaked every time he moved. A small desk in the corner held his school books, neatly stacked, and next to them was the small box where he kept his photograph. He had taken it out again, smoothing the edges as he did every night. Tonight, though, it felt different. The woman in the picture wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was real. She had a name. He traced the outline of her face with his finger. "Why didn't you want me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The door creaked open, and Helen Parker's face appeared in the doorway. "Corey," she said sharply, "lights out. You have school in the morning." "Yes, ma'am," he replied quickly, tucking the photograph under his pillow. As the door closed, Corey lay down and stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. The moment he had stood in court and called Judge Wilson his mom replayed over and over. Had he done the right thing? Would she believe him? A part of him feared the DNA test. What if it came back negative? What if he had been wrong, and she wasn't his mother after all? But deep down he knew. He had seen it in her eyes, the way they had widened with recognition, the way her hand had trembled as she held the photograph. Susan couldn't sleep. She wandered into her living room, clutching a blanket around her shoulders. The city lights twinkled faintly through the window, but they did little to soothe her. She thought about the boy who had stood so bravely in her courtroom. What had his life been like? What had he endured? Her mind drifted to her own life, her accomplishments, her sacrifices, the walls she had built around herself. She had always told herself she didn't need anyone, that her work was enough. But now, faced with the possibility of reconnecting with the son she had given up, she felt a deep, aching void she hadn't realized was there. As the hours ticked by, Susan sat in the darkness, the photograph still in her hand, and wondered what the next few days would bring. The days stretched long and slow, each hour filled with a quiet tension that clung to Susan like a shadow. She moved through her routines mechanically, her mind elsewhere. Even simple tasks, like sipping her morning coffee or reviewing legal documents, felt like distractions from the question that gnawed at her soul. What will the test reveal? The photograph had taken up a permanent place on her desk, its edges curling slightly from years of wear. It was as if its presence anchored her, reminding her that whatever came next, she had a responsibility, a chance to right what had gone so terribly wrong. At the Parkers' home, Corey was quiet, more so than usual. He had always been the kind of boy who preferred solitude, but now his silence seemed heavier. Helen Parker noticed, but she didn't press him. She assumed it was nerves about the custody hearing, though she was beginning to feel the weight of the uncertainty herself. Corey, however, wasn't worried about the Parkers. He didn't feel safe here, not really, but he had learned to adapt. What consumed his thoughts was Judge Wilson. Sitting at his desk one evening, he pulled out the small notebook he kept hidden under a stack of school books. It was where he wrote his thoughts, things he couldn't say aloud. Flipping to a blank page, he picked up a pencil and began to write. "I don't know if she wants me. Maybe she's mad I said it in court. She looked scared, not like I thought she would. But she held the picture, and she didn't throw it away. That has to mean something, right?" He paused, staring at the faint pencil marks, before continuing. "If she doesn't want me, I don't know what I'll do. But at least I'll know. At least I'll stop wondering." Susan found herself lingering at the edges of her memories more often than she wanted to. She thought about the day she left the adoption agency, the sting of tears blurring her vision as she signed the final papers. "You're doing the right thing," the social worker had told her. "He'll be placed with a family that loves him." At the time, she had clung to those words like a lifeline, but now they felt like hollow promises. If Corey had ended up in foster care, had she been deceived, or had something gone wrong along the way? One night, unable to bear the silence of her home, she picked up the phone and dialed an old friend from law school, Dr. Beth Davis, who had become a child psychologist. "Beth, it's Susan," she said when the call connected. "Susan, it's been ages. What's going on?" Beth's voice was warm, a stark contrast to Susan's unease. "I need some advice," Susan said hesitantly. "It's complicated." Over the next half hour, Susan explained everything. The photograph, Corey's declaration, the DNA test. Beth listened without interrupting, her tone growing serious as Susan finished. "This isn't just about the test, is it?" Beth finally said. "You're afraid of what comes next." Susan sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "I don't know how to be a mother, Beth. I've spent my whole life focused on my career. What if I'm not what he needs? What if I've already failed him beyond repair?" "You're overthinking this," Beth said gently. "If the test confirms he's your son, you'll have time to figure it out. Kids don't need perfection, Susan. They need someone who cares, someone who shows up. And from what you've told me, it sounds like Corey has been waiting for someone to show up his whole life. Susan was silent, Beth's words settling heavily in her chest. 3 days after the courtroom revelation, Susan received a call from her clerk, Lisa. Judge Wilson, the DNA results are in, Lisa said. Her voice was calm, but carried a note of anticipation. Susan closed her eyes, gripping the edge of her desk. And, it's a match, Lisa said softly. Corey is your son. The words hung in the air, both a confirmation and a challenge. Susan thanked Lisa and hung up, staring blankly at her desk. She had known, deep down, what the results would say, but hearing it aloud made it real in a way she wasn't entirely prepared for. She stood and walked to the window, her hands trembling. The city stretched out before her, alive with movement and noise. For the first time in her career, she felt paralyzed by uncertainty. What was she supposed to do now? That evening, a social worker arrived at the Parkers' home to deliver the news to Corey. Corey, the woman said gently, as she sat across from him at the kitchen table. The DNA test confirmed it. Judge Wilson is your biological mother. Corey's eyes widened, and for a moment, he didn't speak. Then, he smiled, a small, cautious smile that hinted at the hope he had been holding on to. What happens now? He asked quietly. Well, the social worker continued. Judge Wilson has requested to meet with you privately. She wants to talk to you, if you're comfortable with that. Corey nodded quickly. I want to see her. That night, Susan sat in her living room, staring at the photograph once more. Tomorrow, she would meet Corey, not as a judge, but as his mother. She felt unprepared, unsure of how to navigate this new reality. But one thing Beth had said echoed in her mind. Kids don't need perfection. They need someone who shows up. For the first time in years, Susan prayed, not for herself, but for the courage to be what Corey needed her to be. The morning dawned cold and gray, a veil of clouds hanging low over the city. Susan sat at her kitchen table, staring into a mug of untouched coffee. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second dragging her closer to the meeting she had been both dreading and anticipating. She had chosen a simple outfit, a navy blazer and slacks, but had spent far too long debating whether it was too formal. In the end, she decided it was better to be herself, or at least the version of herself she knew how to be. The weight of her thoughts pressed heavily on her chest. What do you say to a child you gave away? What do you say to your son when he's been waiting for years, and you've only just realized he existed? The photograph lay in her purse, a talisman she couldn't bring herself to leave behind. Corey sat on a worn bench in the family visitation room at the Child Services office. His small hands rested on his knees, his back straight as he waited. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the pale green walls were dotted with cheerful posters that seemed out of place. He glanced at the clock on the wall, the minute hand ticking toward 10. His heart thudded in his chest, a mix of excitement and fear swirling in his stomach. The social worker, Miss Jones, sat beside him, offering a kind smile. She'll be here soon, she said gently. Corey nodded but didn't respond. He kept his eyes fixed on the door, rehearsing what he might say. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, what she would look like, how she would sound. But now that it was real, his mind felt blank. Susan's car pulled into the small parking lot outside the building. She gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. The brick facade of the Child Services office loomed before her, unremarkable, yet suddenly monumental. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. You're a judge, Susan. You face people every day. You can do this. But this wasn't like any courtroom encounter. This was personal, raw, and terrifying. She grabbed her purse, feeling the familiar edges of the photograph inside, and stepped out of the car. Inside, a receptionist greeted her and directed her to the visitation room. The walk down the hallway felt endless, each step echoing loudly in her ears. When she reached the door, she hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle. Then, she pushed it open. The room was small and plain, with a table and a few chairs. Corey sat on the bench, his legs swinging slightly, his expression both cautious and curious. For a moment, Susan simply stood there, taking him in. He was smaller than she had expected, his frame slight but sturdy. His dark eyes, her eyes, met hers, and for the first time, she saw herself reflected in someone else. Hi, she said softly, her voice catching. Hi, Corey replied, standing up. Miss Jones smiled and gestured to the chairs. Why don't you both sit down? I'll give you some privacy. As the door clicked shut behind her, the room grew still. Susan and Corey sat across from each other, the table between them feeling both too small and too vast. Susan cleared her throat, unsure how to begin. Corey, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I'm so glad we're meeting today. Corey nodded, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his sweater. Me too. She took a deep breath, her hands folded tightly on the table. I know you must have so many questions, and I want to answer them, whatever you want to know. But first, I need to say I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for not being there for you. Corey's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. I thought I was doing the right thing. She continued, her voice thick with emotion. I was young, and I wasn't ready to be a mother. I thought if I gave you up, you'd have a better life. But if I had known you'd end up in foster care, I would have never let you go. Corey looked down, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. It wasn't all bad, he said quietly. Some homes were okay, but a lot of them weren't. Susan felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost physical. I wish I could go back and change things, she said softly. But I can't. All I can do is promise to be here for you now, however you need me to be. Corey looked up at her then, his expression unreadable. Do you want me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question cut through Susan like a knife. She reached into her purse and pulled out the photograph, sliding it across the table to him. I've always wanted you, she said, her voice trembling. Even when I didn't let myself think about it, I wanted you to have the best life possible. And now that I know you're here, you're my son, Corey. Of course, I want you. Corey stared at the photograph, his fingers brushing the worn edges, his lips pressed together. And for a moment, Susan thought he might cry, but instead, he nodded, his small shoulders relaxing slightly. Okay, he said softly. They talked for nearly an hour, their conversation hesitant but genuine. Susan learned about his favorite books, his dreams of becoming an engineer, and his love for building things. Corey learned about her work as a judge, her childhood in Chicago, and her love of classical music. It wasn't perfect. There were pauses, moments where neither of them knew what to say. But it was a start. As their time came to an end, Susan reached across the table and took his hand in hers. Corey, she said, her voice firm, I don't know what the future will look like yet, but I want you to know that you're not alone anymore. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Corey looked at her, his dark eyes shining with cautious hope. Okay, he said again, his voice stronger this time. When they stood to leave, Susan hesitated, then leaned down and hugged him. He stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed, his small arms wrapping around her. For the first time in years, Susan felt something shift inside her, an ache she hadn't fully acknowledged, beginning to heal. The days following their first meeting were filled with uncertainty and cautious steps forward. Susan had arranged for supervised visits, to give Corey time to adjust and ensure he felt safe. Each meeting took place at the same child services office, a neutral space where both of them could slowly get to know one another. Susan spent hours preparing for each visit. She pored over books about reconnecting with estranged children, consulted Beth for advice, and replayed every word of their previous conversations in her mind. But no amount of preparation could fully silence the gnawing question that lingered. Am I enough for him? For Corey, the meetings were both exciting and terrifying. He carried the photograph with him wherever he went, keeping it tucked in his pocket as a reminder that Susan was real and that she cared. But he struggled to trust fully. Years of moving between foster homes had taught him to keep his expectations low, to guard his heart against disappointment. Susan seemed kind, but she also seemed distant, like she was still figuring out how to connect with him. During one visit, he blurted out a question that had been weighing on him. Do you even know how to be a mom? Susan froze, caught off guard by the bluntness of his words. She considered lying, but the look in Corey's eyes stopped her. He didn't need reassurance. He needed honesty. No, she admitted softly, I don't. I've spent my whole life working, focusing on my career. I've never had anyone rely on me the way you should have been able to rely on me. But I'm willing to learn, Corey. If you'll give me a chance, I'll do my best. Her honesty surprised him. He nodded, though he didn't respond right away. It wasn't the answer he had hoped for, but it was real, and that was something he could respect. Susan threw herself into building a relationship with Corey. She began visiting him at the Parkers' home, bringing books, puzzles, and other small gifts she thought he might like. She wanted to show him she was invested, even if she wasn't sure what she was doing. One evening, she brought a model airplane kit, remembering his love for building things. "I thought we could work on this together," she said, placing the box on the table. Corey's face lit up briefly, before he caught himself, his expression slipping back into guarded neutrality. "Okay," he said, picking up the box and inspecting it. They spent the next hour assembling the tiny pieces, the quiet punctuated by Susan's occasional questions about his day and Corey's cautious answers. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Helen and Mark Parker watched these interactions with growing discomfort. At first, they had been confident the custody case would go in their favor, but Susan's involvement had shifted the dynamic. "She's overstepping," Helen muttered one evening, as she watched Susan and Corey work on the model plane. "This isn't her role." Mark frowned but didn't reply. He wasn't thrilled about Susan's presence either, but he also knew their household wouldn't hold up under scrutiny if the case took a closer look. One rainy afternoon, during another supervised visit, Susan decided to take a risk. She brought a box of photographs from her own childhood, images of her parents, her younger self, and even the few pictures she had from her college years. "I thought you might want to see these," she said, setting the box on the table. Corey hesitated, then slowly reached for the box. He pulled out a photograph of Susan as a little girl, her hair in pigtails, and her face lit with a wide smile. "That's you?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Susan smiled. "That's me. I was about your age in that picture." Corey studied the photo closely, then looked up at her. "You look happy." "I was," she said softly. "I had a good childhood, and I want you to have that too, Corey. I know it's late, but I want to try." For the first time, Corey's defenses seemed to lower. He didn't say much, but he carefully sifted through the rest of the photos, asking the occasional question about the people and places in them. By the end of the visit, something had shifted between them. The silence felt less like a barrier and more like an understanding. That evening, Susan sat in her living room, reflecting on the day. For the first time in years, she felt something she couldn't quite put into words, a fragile sense of connection, of belonging. She pulled out her phone and called Beth. "I think we're making progress," she said, her voice soft. "It's slow, but it feels real." Beth's response was warm. "That's what matters, Susan. It's not about getting it perfect. It's about showing up and letting him see that you care." Susan nodded, even though Beth couldn't see her. "I just hope it's enough." "It will be," Beth assured her. "Just keep going." In his room that night, Corey pulled out his notebook and began to write. "She's not like I thought she'd be. She's nervous, but she keeps coming back, and that means something. I don't know if I can trust her yet, but I think I want to try." He paused, tapping the pencil against the page, before adding, "Maybe this is what family feels like." The weeks passed slowly, each visit between Susan and Corey weaving an intricate, delicate thread of connection. Susan's careful efforts began to chip away at Corey's walls, and he, in turn, revealed small glimpses of his guarded heart. But progress was fragile, and both of them carried wounds that hadn't yet healed. On a crisp Saturday morning, Susan arrived at the Parkers' home with a plan. She had suggested taking Corey to the local park, hoping the fresh air and open space would give them a chance to connect without the constraints of the sterile visitation rooms. Corey hesitated when she suggested it, glancing at Helen Parker for approval. Helen, her arms crossed, gave a tight nod. "Just don't be out too long," she said. The park was quieter than Susan had expected, the trees lining the paths shedding their golden leaves in the autumn breeze. She and Corey walked side by side, their pace unhurried. "Do you like the fall?" Susan asked, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. Corey shrugged. "I guess. It's okay." Susan smiled faintly. "I always liked it when I was a kid. My dad used to rake up all the leaves in our yard, and my brother and I would jump in them before he could bag them up. Drove him crazy." Corey glanced at her, a flicker of curiosity in his expression. "You have a brother?" "I did," Susan said softly. "He passed away a long time ago. But he was a good guy. Funny. Always getting into trouble." Corey nodded, his gaze shifting to the trees ahead. "I never had anyone like that," he said quietly. Susan's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that he had her now, but she wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. Instead, she gestured toward a nearby bench. "Let's sit for a bit," she said. As they sat together, Susan noticed Corey pulling something from his pocket. It was a small, worn notebook, the edges curled from use. He opened it to a page and stared at it for a moment before handing it to her. Susan took the notebook carefully, her eyes scanning the page. It was a list, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. Why did you give me up? Did you think about me? Do you want me now? What happens if this doesn't work? The last question stopped her. She looked up at Corey, who was staring at the ground, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. These are your questions? She asked gently. He nodded, still not meeting her gaze. I've had them for a while. I didn't know if I should ask you. Margaret's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. She reached over, placing the notebook on the bench between them. Corey, she began, her voice steady. I don't have all the answers, but I'll tell you what I can, and I'll be honest with you. He looked up then, his dark eyes searching hers. Why did you give me up? Susan took a deep breath. I was young, barely older than a kid myself. I was in law school, and I wasn't ready to be a mother. I thought if I gave you to a family who could take care of you, it would be better for you. I believed I was doing the right thing. Corey's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't speak. But it wasn't, she said. It wasn't, Susan admitted, her voice cracking. It wasn't. I didn't know you ended up in foster care. If I had, I would have done everything differently. There was a long silence, the wind rustling the leaves around them. Do you want me now? He asked, his voice trembling. Susan didn't hesitate. Yes, I want you in my life, Corey. I want to be the mother I couldn't be before. I know it won't be easy, but I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Corey nodded slowly, his face still guarded, but softer. Okay, he said, his voice barely audible. They sat in silence for a while longer, the notebook still resting between them. Susan didn't push him to talk, letting him take the lead. Eventually, Corey reached over and picked it up, tucking it back into his pocket. As they walked back toward the car, Susan glanced at him. Thank you for trusting me with your questions, she said. Corey looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Thanks for answering, he replied. When Susan dropped Corey off at the Parkers' house, Helen was waiting at the door, her arms crossed. You were gone longer than I expected, she said, her tone sharp. We lost track of time, Susan replied evenly. Helen's eyes narrowed. You're getting too close. He's still under our care, and we're the ones who've been there for him all this time. Susan felt anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, but she kept her voice measured. I'm not trying to undermine you, Mrs. Parker. I'm trying to build a relationship with my son. Helen's expression darkened, but she said nothing further. Susan gave Corey a small wave before turning to leave. That evening, Susan sat in her living room, the weight of the day settling over her. The questions Corey had asked replayed in her mind, each one a reminder of the pain and uncertainty he carried. She thought about the look in his eyes when he asked if she wanted him. It was a look she would never forget, a mix of fear, hope, and longing. Pulling out her phone, she called Beth again. How do I make sure he knows I'm not going to give up on him? Susan asked, her voice filled with emotion. You keep showing up, Beth said simply. That's how trust is built, one day at a time. Susan nodded to herself. She was starting to understand that this wasn't about grand gestures or immediate solutions. It was about being present, consistently and unwaveringly. And she was determined to do just that. Susan stood in her kitchen, staring out the window as the morning sunlight poured in, warming the room. It had been 6 months since the day Corey walked into her courtroom and changed her life forever. 6 months of difficult conversations, shared laughter, and learning what it meant to be a family. She glanced at the small table in the corner, where Corey now often sat, sketching designs for his dream projects. A treehouse, a robot, a tiny car he swore he could really drive. The table used to be bare, but now it was cluttered with pencils, scraps of paper, and model parts. It made the house feel alive in a way she hadn't known it could. Corey had moved in with her a month ago, after the Parkers' custody petition was withdrawn. The investigation into their care revealed the truth about their neglect, leaving the judge with little choice but to revoke their rights. Corey had packed his few belongings into a single duffel bag and walked into Susan's home with quiet uncertainty. At first, there had been tension. Susan had found herself second-guessing every decision. What to cook, where to set boundaries, how to help him feel at home. Corey had been cautious, testing her sincerity in small ways, like asking if he could leave his shoes in the middle of the living room, just to see if she would get angry. But over time, they found their rhythm. Susan learned to be patient, to let go of the need for perfection. Corey began to trust her, bit by bit, as he saw that her promises weren't just words. The photograph that had once been folded and hidden in Corey's pocket now sat in a frame on the mantel. Next to it was a new picture, a candid shot Susan had taken of Corey sitting on the porch, his face lit up with a wide smile as he held up a finished model plane. That picture was her favorite. It reminded her of the moments they had worked for, the small victories that made the hard days worth it. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Corey turned to her suddenly. "Do you think I'll ever feel normal?" he asked. Susan put an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "What do you mean by normal?" "Like, not always waiting for something bad to happen," he said quietly. Her heart ached at his honesty, but she didn't look away. "Corey, you've been through things no kid should ever have to go through. It's going to take time to heal. But I promise you, you're not alone anymore. You're home now." He nodded slowly, leaning into her. "I think I believe you," he said. Susan smiled, brushing a hand through his hair. "That's all I need." The months that followed weren't perfect, but they were theirs. They celebrated Corey's 13th birthday together, with a homemade cake and his first ever sleepover. Susan joined the PTA at his school, much to her own surprise, and began attending his science fairs and soccer games. Corey started calling her Mom one evening, without fanfare, as if the word had always been meant for her. Susan had to excuse herself to the kitchen to hide her tears. One day, while cleaning, Susan found Corey's old notebook tucked under his bed. She opened it to the page with his list of questions, the questions that had once seemed like a wall between them. Next to the final question, "What happens if this doesn't work?" Corey had written, in shaky pencil, "It did." Susan closed the notebook and held it to her chest, her eyes misting over. It had worked. They had found each other, not perfectly, but in a way that mattered. And for the first time in her life, Susan Wilson knew what it meant to truly be a mother. And so, what began as a routine day in court transformed into a life-changing moment, a reunion that neither Susan nor Corey could have imagined. Through patience, vulnerability, and the courage to face the past, they found something truly priceless, the chance to heal and build a future together. This story reminds us that it's never too late for love, forgiveness, and second chances. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and, most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Turn on the notifications so you never miss another powerful story. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.